Hello, welcome back to Production Corner. We're back. To kick things off, I'm going to be talking about something that's maybe quite misunderstood, but actually very basic. And all you need to do is listen to what I'm about to say, really. And hopefully things might get a little bit demystified for you. So, today's topic, the channel strip. Whether you are a dance music producer or a band member or someone that just engineers metal bands, anything, songwriter, it is essential to understand signal flow and a channel strip. Now, I can understand looking at a massive mixing desk can be quite daunting because it's huge and it's full of knobs and buttons and you're probably afraid to touch it. In this video, I'm hopefully going to demystify it for you. So you should be able to walk into any studio and understand what's going on. But not just that, how to apply that to your DAW. So to start things off, let's start small. Let me grab my mixer. Bam, mixing desk. This is a very small mixing desk. This is a Mackie Mix FX 12 or Mix 12 effects. It's 12 channels worth of things with effects in it. This is no different in theory to a huge, massive mixing desk that you might find at Metropolis, say. So let's talk through this. First of all, let's disregard everything here and just look at this one strip. Every mixing desk ever in the world of mixing desks will run this signal flow. You may have an extended version of this, but the signal flow kind of stays the same. First of all, you put things in it. Microphones, instruments, whatever you like. Mic level, line level, it's up to you. You then have a gain stage. This is where you determine the level coming in. So whether that's your microphone volume, whether that's your guitar volume, your any instrument volume. Okay, this is extremely important because this determines how loud the signal is going to be processed at, incoming signal. As you can see from this mixing desk, we then run through a EQ section. This is a very basic EQ with high, mid and low. This is a fixed band EQ. On some other bigger consoles, like I said, that you might find at Metropolis, you would see extended or more elaborate versions of this EQ section. So you may find that they're parametric, meaning that you can decide what frequency each of these bands hold, the width of those frequencies and so on. However, because this is a small scale mixer, you only get to pick the volumes of fixed bands. As we move down, you have here a kill switch, still part of the EQ. This cuts out any frequencies below a certain number. In this case, 75 Hertz. Push button in, no bass. Next, we move on to our auxiliary section. This is labeled as effects on this mixer. This basically sends the volume that's come in from our gain and through our EQ with a volume knob off to somewhere else to get effects on it. You are sending to some effects. This is called an effects section, most commonly an auxiliary section. After that, we have our pan pot. This is where we can decide if we want it left, center or right, or anywhere in between. And then lastly, the volume output or the fader. This volume and this volume are completely different. This volume determines the audio coming in, the noise coming in, how loud the sound is itself, the source volume. All this is an output volume, like what you would find on a car radio, for instance. It's not turning down the actual song, it's just turning the volume down to the speakers. That's all this is. This then feeds a master fader. So this is your level, your output level, going to the master fader at the end over here. Now, as you can see, this is a very basic mixer. It's kind of easy to understand. Input, how loud you want that input to be, goes through an EQ stage where you can decide if you want some bass in it or not, some higher tops, whatever. Goes through the options to have some effects that you can send to maybe this track to a reverb, for instance, by that amount. You then got a pan pot, left, right, center, and then you've got an overall volume, which then you can get a balance of volumes for your individual inputs and an overall output volume. I don't have an SSL console here. It would be really good if I could go to Metropolis perhaps and just see an SSL console. All right. Metropolis Studio B. This is an iconic studio. It's probably my favorite studio in Metropolis. The desk that you see here is a SSL 4000G series. This is iconic, a classic, and quite daunting. However, the channel strip, of which there are many here, is no different to that one. The signal flow is exactly the same. Now I'm going to show you one of the channel strips behind me on this desk, and just so you can see how not that different it is to something small scale or something that you're used to, and how a channel strip in your DAW works. So here we are. This is the SSL G Series 4000 desk. Now this single strip is one channel. Now, as you can see here, this is 56 channels. So this desk holds 56 of exactly the same thing. So all you need to understand is what one of these things do. Now, this order of information is exactly the same as the smaller desk that we looked at earlier on. So let's go from the top to bottom. First of all, we're going to disregard this section up here because this is our routing section. So to keep things simple, we're going to just forget about this section here because this is where you decide to assign certain microphones or anything, where you decide where things go and so on. So we're going to forget about this. We're going to start from, so first of all, at the very top, we have our gain section. So here we have both line and mic separated gains, whereas on the other small mixer, we had one input for line and one input for mic, and we had one gain. So basically one would override the other. If you had a mic plugged in, it would be gaining with the microphone. However, if you plugged something into line, it would override that. This section here, it gives you the option on this desk to input both a mic and a line, but pick between the two. On here you have 48 volts phantom power, you have a phase invert for each channel, and you also have a flip button, so you can flick between line and mic. Next, we move down into the dynamics section. Now, this section on this desk is both compression and gating. So what this does is you have a compressor at the very top, which is a classic SSL style compressor, and then you move into a gating section. To have the compressor in the circuit, you can just simply put it in the chain or not, and then that is your dynamic section. This did not feature on that smaller mixer. However, the next section did feature. So this next section is our EQ section. Here we have an expanded EQ. On the smaller mixer, what we were looking at was a fixed band EQ, where you had a high frequency, a mid frequency, and a low frequency. Here you have a high frequency, which is a shelf. You then have a sweepable parametric high mid frequency, and the same for the low mid frequency. And then you have a shelving EQ for the low frequency. So this is what's known as a semi-parametric equalizer. It gives you the option to choose frequencies, and on your high mid and low mid frequencies, you get to pick the width of those frequency bands. You also have at the top here filter section. On the other mixer, the filter section was just a button at 75 Hertz. This, on the other hand, gives you the option to have a high pass and a low pass filter, and it also gives you the option to choose what frequency that is. So bearing in mind, let's look at the first section here. We've got our gaining section, which is on the smaller mixer. We've then got our dynamics section, which holds a compressor and a gate, which we didn't see on the smaller mixer. And then we've got a EQ section, which we did see on the smaller mixer. The only difference between these, obviously the addition of some dynamics, is the expanded versions of the sections. So on the smaller mixer, we had a very limited EQ, but we still had an EQ. On this one, we get so much more possibilities from the EQ settings. If we move down, we next get to the auxiliary section. Now, if you remember from the small mixer, we had one knob for the auxiliaries. This was just one auxiliary send to effects. Here we have a variety of sends. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 auxiliary sends, and we have a dedicated queue. This can be used to send signals from this track to headphones, and these can also be used for headphones, but these can also be mainly used to send these channels to certain effects. Further down from this track, we have smaller faders. These can be used for micro gaining. So when you're recording in, you can have smaller amounts, smaller increments. You can have this desk flipped, so these are your recording or monitoring stages. But this, as you can see, you have two sets of faders. These are your main faders, of which you can then decide what grouped VCA these goes to. As you can see, it's extremely expanded in terms of the possibilities of what you can do with each channel. However, the signal flow is exactly the same. You've got an input section from gain. You then go through some certain effects, whether that's dynamics or EQ. On the smaller mixer, it was just EQ. You then go through an auxiliary section, and then you go down through to your fader section, where you have things like your pans, solos, and mutes. Now let's think about a channel strip in a DAW. When you think about it, for instance, in Logic, you have a strip like this. This section here would be your inserts. So your insert effects, if you want to put EQs in or dynamics in or whatever you want. This section here would be your input section. So what is actually coming into this track. This is where you can decide what comes into the track. We move down, you've got your sends section, so where you can send to auxiliaries and send out to effects. And then you have your output section and fader section. This is where you can decide the panning. This is where you can decide the level. It works exactly the same in a DAW. So as you can see, not that much different. Now it's time to think how we can do this in a DAW and try and mimic what we have here in our own little spaces. So I suppose that means I've got to go back to my own studio, doesn't it? As if by magic again, We're back with my own small little space that's not Metropolis. But anyway, let's try and mimic that in a DAW. So as you can see here, I'm in Logic Pro X. This is the latest version of Logic. However, you can pretty much do this with versions of Logic that date back maybe 4 or 5 years. Here, I'm mimicking the channel strip of the SSL. So let me talk you through this. Over on the left, we have here our channel strip. I've called this SSL Channel 1, just for aesthetic purposes. We then have our mix bus. This is going to the master section. What's the point, you might ask? The point is this. We are going to adopt an exact workflow replica of that channel strip using stock plugins. So here's how we do this. First of all, if you remember from the channel strip, other than the output section or the routing section at the very top with the little buttons, the first thing you had was a gain. Now on this gain section, you had the gain for it, you had phase invert and so on. In Logic, our first plugin in the chain, if I come down to the utilities, we have something called gain. That is this plugin here. It's nice and big for you. Bosh. This has pretty much all of the things that you would find on the console, other than stuff like phantom power, which you would use on your interface. This has your gain and it has your phase reverse. It also has other things on there that you don't have on the console. For instance, swap left and right. Mono, very useful. Let's make this smaller again. Let's move on to our next section of the channel strip. If you remember correctly, the next section on the channel strip was a compressor. In Logic, you have the option to use various circuit types. Let's make this bigger. The vintage VCA is a replica of the SSL bus compressor, which you saw on the console. What we've done here is we haven't bypassed it. We're still letting audio run through it as if it would have done in the actual channel strip, but we've put the threshold to 0. This means it's only going to compress once the audio goes past digital 0. If it goes past that, it's known as clipping, which isn't a good thing. Good practice is to stay under that. So really, in theory, this won't be engaging if you've got a good gain structure. And we move back to the gain plugin in order to sort that out. The other good thing about this compressor is that it's not just the compressor controls. I've got another input gain section here. So depending on what my overall input of the channel is doing, I've still got a further level of input gain into the compressor. If you remember correctly, the second part of that dynamics section was a gate. Now, gating is often used in tracking in some cases for things like drums in order to get rid of spill. It's not necessarily used on every single track, just like compression is not necessarily used on every track, but just to have it there is mimicking that workflow. So what we've got here is the same kind of fashion as the compressor. We've set the threshold here to 0 dB, meaning that nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to start cutting out or gating out of signal until it passes the threshold of 0 decibels, which in, again, Logic's terms is anything past that, you've gone too far, you've ruined it. We can have this bypassed completely. So I could come over to our channel strip here and just bypass this and not have it on at all. Same with the compressor. I'm going to leave these both on, just knowing that they're on and it's running through the process. However, it's not engaging its overall intended use. Next on the channel strip was an EQ. Now in Logic there's a few EQs that you can choose from that give you flavour and so on. All I'm going to use for this one is the standard channel EQ. This is at the bottom here. Again, I'll make this bigger. This is going to give us a fully parametric equalizer that's fairly clean. It doesn't really incur any warmth or saturation or flavour or colour to the sound. It's just there to sculpt the sound when we need it. This is going to be last in our chain of processes, because if you remember correctly from the channel strip, this was the last processing section. Move this back down. I hope you're appreciating how I've done this diagonal signal flow as well, fitting it all into one screen. Just hope you appreciate that. There. Next, we have our auxiliary section. Again, if you remember from the SSL channel strip, we had a full auxiliary section where we could send our signal from this track that has gone through our processing off to various effects. At the moment, I'm not showing these channels in the mixer. I can do this in Logic just by coming up here and clicking on the aux view. Now I've got auxiliary 1, 2, 3 and 4, bus 1, 2, 3 and 4. And from here, I can pick any effects that I want. So for instance, let's go for auxiliary 1. Let's pick a reverb for this. So we'll pick chroma verb, which will be our first reverb. Our second auxiliary will be another reverb, but let's say in this case, let's pick a space designer, something that can give us a bit more of a intended real life space. So a cathedral or a hall or something. So we've got a convolution reverb and we've got an algorithmic reverb. Next on auxiliary 3, I'm going to choose a delay. So we're going to go to our delay menu and I'm going to pick the stereo. Oh no, I'm going to pick the tape delay. Have it nice and authentic vintage there. We're going to keep this fully wet because it's on an auxiliary, remember. Put the feedback up a bit, keep that at quarter note, that'll do. And lastly, on our last effects bus, I'm going to pick a compressor. Now the reason for this is so I can add in some parallel compression to make things pop out the mix a bit. Now I'm going to use a classic vintage FET. Now if you remember from Studio B earlier, this visual might look a little bit like one of the pieces of equipment that was in the studio, the 1176 compressor. So I'm going to be picking this for my parallel compression duties. If I move this across a little bit, you'll see on my mix bus, I have another one of those compressors. This is going to act as our mix bus compressor. So all of our tracks are going to end up going to our mix bus, our stereo output. And on this, I've got that SSL style compressor. So let's get rid of these plugins for a minute. And so far, we have a 1-track mixer. We have a channel strip that's got 1 track. That's it. We've got 4 auxiliary tracks and we've got a mix bus. If I want to make this more, let's change our view for a minute. You can see we've got our main channel strip. What I can do now is duplicate this track over as many times as I want to make a 48 channel SSL desk. I could make a 24 channel SSL desk. I can make as many as I want. What I'm going to do is just set up a 16 channel one for now, just so it's a bit easier to navigate. So I'm going to click our duplicate icon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We now have 16 of those exact channels. So let me go back to the mixer window. I now have 16 exact channels with the same channel strip settings, the same everything as each other. All the same auxiliary possibilities. So every single one of my 16 tracks I could send off to a reverb at various amounts, a delay at various amounts, some parallel compression at various amounts, and it is mimicking the genuine, authentic channel strip signal flow. Now to move on from this, you can add in your own flavored plugins, but trying to think about where those plugins fit in the real world. So how a channel strip actually looks. One of the things you can do within the channel strip in the hardware version on that actual SSL desk is you can pick the dynamics to be pre or post EQ, or the EQ to be pre or post dynamics. This means that I can put the EQ before the compressor or after it. This is exactly the same in Logic. It's as simple as going to, say, my last track, grabbing the EQ and dragging it above the compressor. So now I have a gain going into the EQ, then going into the compressor. It's exactly the same sort of workflow. And now I've got the option to do this on each track. Some of them I might want to compress first, others I might want to EQ first, but it gives me the option to do that, but I've still got that workflow in mind. Let me just put that back for my own sanity, really. I just need to make sure that that's correct. There we go. So as you can see, it's not an actual SSL console, but it's as close as I'm going to get in my production corner. There we go. We did it. Demystifying the channel strip. It's not that hard really when you think about it. It's just a bit daunting walking into a huge studio and just seeing like masses of channel strips. It's just loads of the same thing. If you understand what one of them is, it's pretty self-explanatory. Also the fact that things are color coded really helps. It's not all one color. It's not all like grey. You've got different colours for different things. And then also how to mimic that workflow in a DAW using stock plugins. Now granted, it's not going to sound like an actual SSL G-Series 4000 nutso desk. However, you're applying the same workflow and good practice. That's it for this episode. Next episode, more geekery. See you then.